It's absolutely critical in any film to have a character that you're willing to go on the journey with. And people use the term a fully realized character. But I think it's important to understand that film is a very stylized art form. It's not capable of the kind of novelistic detail of a 600 or 1,000 page novel. So you're never going to know everything about that character. You have to fill in the blanks with bits and pieces of your own life and those of your friends and so on. So how do you do all that? Well, you have to find little universal things that you can relate to from one's life as an audience member, and have the character do something or do things that you recognize. You can set huge challenges for yourself if it's a nonverbal character and you're putting so much on the actor to express with their eyes, with their face, with their yearning expression, or whatever it is. But every character is a creation that exists between the screenplay, the imagined character, which is still out of focus. We don't apply a face yet. And then the director's imagination of what that can be on the screen. And then the actor fills in the final and ultimately most important piece. What does this person look like? How do they move? How do they speak? So a character is really never more than a sketch, but it has to be a very compelling sketch. Giving an average person, a relatable average person, an enormous problem and seeing how they solve that problem or process that problem is a good way to get buy-in. You basically want the audience to buy into the narrative, and they usually buy into the narrative through the characters. It's key in the way that you introduce a character to understand where they are in their life, what they're feeling, and what their problem is. Any character that you're going to follow has got a problem. And that problem needs to be declared fairly early on. Sometimes you can do it in the very first scene. And then the whole movie should ultimately be about somehow that problem gets addressed, gets resolved. Or at least we understand it as the thing that drove that character into whatever situation evolves. And the problem may escalate as well. But I do believe in the kind of, principle of character is destiny. That character winds up in a situation of their own creation in some way. And it's somehow related to them solving their problem, whatever their problem might be. It might be that nobody sees them, that they're kind of invisible to the people around them, that they haven't found who they are yet or a way of expressing it. It may be that they don't have love, or that they've lost love and are now incapable of opening themselves to a new relationship. Whatever the character's problem is, you need to define it early on, and you need to do it in an interesting way where the audience can sympathize, because we have this capacity for empathy and for understanding other people. It's innate to who we are as human beings. So you introduce a character, and then we somehow relate to that character. Even if that character is Frankenstein's monster and the story is told from the perspective of the monster, we must somehow find a way, a sense of empathy. The film must create that in us, an interest in that character. I think it's about expressing something that the audience can relate to, and you care about the outcome, or at the very least, you care about seeing what this person is going to do next, and what's around the corner for them. In the case of the Terminator, the initial idea was that there was an entity sent from the future to kill somebody in the past whose life had great meaning. I pretty quickly went to a female character whose son in the future will become a great sort of prophet. So basically a kind of Virgin Mary character, because that's an archetype that we all get quite quickly. And she was, in the biblical story, of very humble origins, basically kind of a peasant, or her husband was a tradesman, a carpenter. So I said, all right, a waitress. Very common job, a very dismissible person. I wanted the most dismissible person you could imagine could have been a secretary, could have been a waitress, somebody like that. It's like, couldn't possibly be an important, earth-shaking existence. And I thought, that's good, because that's how most people feel. Most people going to a movie theater are not presidents or heads of major corporations or big important people. They're average people, and they could, I thought, invest in the idea of an average person who is suddenly snatched out of their daily existence and finds out that their life has great meaning in another framework, in another frame of reference, which the film supplies. And all of a sudden, not only is she fighting for her life, but she's fighting for the future of the entire world. She becomes the most important person in the world for a moment in history. So now I'm telling the story from a female perspective. So now I have to draw upon, all the women that I've ever known in my life and or read about, in anything from comic books to novels to the news. Now, it just so happens that just before I wrote that, I was married to a Bob's Big Boy waitress. So I went, Bob's Big Boy waitress, perfect. Write what you know. So I basically wrote my first wife, which was, plucky, a lot of humor, kind of cynical, but likable. And so, boom, there's your character, right? Now, put that character in an extraordinary circumstance. And I think what I would advise is that people be kind of authentic to their own life experience, but not to the extent that you're literally just telling your own life story. I happen to enjoy writing female characters. That's controversial now. There are people that say, oh, well, female characters and films about female characters should be directed by women and they should be written by women. It's like, okay, so I can only write paunchy middle-aged Canadian white guys? I don't think that's how art works. The whole point of acting, the whole point of storytelling, I think, is to live outside yourself. But you have to do it with some connection to your own personal experience. You have to make it personal. But that shouldn't prevent you from writing a character that is not like you. How am I going to introduce my main characters? And how am I going to do that in a way that is the quintessence of that character? What is the quintessence of that character, and how can I encapsulate that, in a kind of almost a synecdoche? A synecdoche is, if I get this right, it's like if you call somebody a suit, you're using the suit as a stand-in for an entire description of them as a corporate executive or whatever. It's basically taking a person and reducing them to a single object or principle. But you want a kind of creative synecdoche of your character when that character's introduced. So I think that there are interesting ways to do that. Colonel Quaritch in Avatar, he was a military guy. He was very formal, and he was in a position of command and authority, and he's introduced with the image of his military boots on a steel floor. We hear the creak of the leather, we hear his voice. He's a very verbal character, and he carried a lot of power in his voice. We see his pistol, we see his broad shoulders, we see the back of his tightly clipped Marine Corps haircut, and we think we know who the guy is, and then he turns to us and he's got these massive scars. And he delivers a line on that
in
turn.
The mud wants to kill you and eat your eyes for jujubes.
I was reasonably pleased with that as a character introduction, because once again he was reduced to that synecdoche of his greater character. He was also a character that didn't exist in shades of gray. Kind of to a fault, he was what you see is what you get. And there wasn't a lot of nuance to his character. There was just a lot of flourish in creating that relatively simplistic character, which is another way to go. I used the Darth Vader example. Darth Vader didn't have a lot of shades of gray in the first movie, but there was some subtlety that was brought into it later, obviously, which was interesting then. But he was kind of archetypal, and that was okay, because it was just do the archetype really, really well and in a new creative way. You also look forward to the moment where that that main character meets that main character. So that moment of introduction is also very important. So when you went to Titanic, you probably knew from the poster at least that there was going to be a girl and going to be a guy. And if you knew more about the film, there was Rose and there was Jack and Leonardo and Kate Winslet. Well, how are they going to meet? Are they going to meet cute? Which is the sort of classic screenwriter term for, do they get in a car crash and have a big argument and then realize they actually like each other? And there are an infinite number of variations of that, and people generally look forward to that moment when the characters collide. In Terminator, it was interesting structurally because it was the end of Act 1 was the three main characters meeting. And they met in a violent life or death confrontation, but we had been following them as individual story streams for an entire act and literally just jumping back and forth between three plot lines and watching these plot lines slowly converging to a point in space and time where everything exploded. And that turned out to be a powerful storytelling method. There's a stylistic cinematic relish in how you introduce character A and character B, and then you look forward to the inevitable moment where character A meets character B, interacts with character B, and then you, I think as a filmmaker, as a screenwriter, you have fun with that, and as actors, you have fun with that. And typically, where the characters are going to wind up is not where they are initially. There's the classic sort of you get two characters together that you know are going to be together later, and you create conflict. And there's an art to that because the audience can smell that a mile away if that conflict feels, forced. Like the screenwriter really needed them to fight, so put a lot of obstacles in their path, and if it doesn't feel authentic and it doesn't feel natural to the situation, feels overblown, the audience goes, yeah, predictable, I knew that. If you're doing a character from a certain period, historical period, or a certain specific situation that you're dramatizing, do your research. Learn everything you can about that world. And if it was a real person, learn everything you can about that person. Ask yourself what was really going on. Because we can't even get the facts right in a news story that about something that happened the day before. And different outlets will argue with each other over what actually happened and what it means. Now imagine history as a distillation of a little bit of coming down to us of basically a bunch of news stories from back then. How much can we trust that? So as you go into history, and I found this on Titanic, you have to ask yourself questions about like what was really happening? Who was really doing what to who here? So you got to do your research. You got to understand the character. If it was a real historical person, really understand them. If it's a made-up person in a real historical setting, what would the forces be at work on that character? What would expectations of them be? How is this character unique? What makes this character interesting? It's relatively easy, in a sense, to write outstanding women outside of the present time because they were always misunderstood and dismissed, and audiences hate it when they're investing in a character and that character is dismissed or misunderstood or judged harshly or not seen for how great they are. So these are all techniques for getting your character to be interesting. Ultimately, what's important is that your characters come to life in your mind. And then they're going to come to life again when you cast the film. How you imagine that character is going to find its final expression through a living, breathing human being who has a look, has a physiognomy, and has a skill set. And, they are going to change that character. The key to it is to get the actor to a safe place where they can explore and they can feel empowered to go as far as they feel like going. Maybe later in the cutting room you say, that might be a little bit too much, or maybe on the set your own instinct kicks in and you say, you know, maybe let's try muting that and let me feel that you know, crazy energy is going on in your mind, but there's something holding you back from saying it quite that way. And let's feel that tension, you know. I mean, after a while, I think one learns to speak a language that actors can hear. Because I think the most sacred part of the job, ultimately, is to help the actor achieve their best work. I like to have done rehearsal so that we can talk through ideas, not lock them in, but stand them up, try it, workshop it. I think of it more as sort of workshopping the script. And often I'll find that dialogue shakes out, because I'll say, all right, just forget about the written word, forget about the page, just improv the scene. This was very helpful in Titanic because some of the language was a bit stilted because it was of its period. And I wanted these two young actors to get a sense for, well, how, just play the scene the way you'd play it now in your current idiom, the way you would speak. And so they just played it as themselves, essentially. I mean, sort of halfway between the character, it was the character but interpreted through contemporary language. And some interesting ideas came out of that. An interesting dynamic came out of it. And I said, all right, I'm going to go off and I'm going to rewrite the scene. And I'm going to put it into the idiom of the time, but it'll be these ideas. It'll be these things that we discovered in rehearsal. I mean, a really good example that I think really added value to a particular scene in Titanic, we were rehearsing the scene where Cal, her fiancé, grabs her arm and tries to drag her aboard the lifeboat, tries to control her, not listen to her as usual. And the way I had written it, she pulls a hat pin out of her hair and sticks him in the arm, forcing him to release her. And she runs away into the crowd. But then, you know, we were talking about the hat pin, and Kate said, well, why don't I just spit in his face? And it was so brilliant. I don't even think she realized how brilliant it was, because it was a callback to a previous scene. The scene in the film where Jack, Leonardo's character, teaches her how to spit like a man. So it was a perfect closure of the ellipse. It was something Jack taught her how to do. And she used it in that moment to end the relationship, or at least she thought so, with Cal.
You call me? What, to him? To be a whore to a gutter rat?
I'd rather be his whore than your wife.
No! I said no!
It was perfect. It was like a moment a writer would go, aha, this is great. I've solved the problem, and she solved it. You know, so that's how we did it. Now, poor Billy Zane didn't particularly like having a big old loogie shot into his face 50 times. By the time we were done shooting that scene, he was well over the idea. But I think it turned out to be a nice moment.